Professor Bhasin?
Yes, I am.
Great. So we've made you a co-host in case you want to show a present. You have a PPT or something like that. Do you have a PPT?
No PPT. I'll just do it straight away.
I see. Okay. All right. Perfect. So I think we're going to. We should schedule it. I'm so sorry for the delay, ma'am. That was owing to something which is happening here today at the university. That's why.
Sure.
All right. So good afternoon, participants. I hope that, yes, I think I can see a substantial number is here. And again, sorry to the participants also who were patiently waiting to be admitted. So very good afternoon to our speaker and all the participants. Today we are very happy to have with Professor Neeti Bhasin. Professor Neeti Bhasin has been teaching at the University of Delhi at the Department of Commerce in the Delhi School of Economics for more than 20 years now. And she has a long experience therefore, and needless to say that she's a professor and therefore she has published several books and research articles in national and international journals of for example, Sage, Taylor and Francis, Emerald, and so on and so forth. But besides all this, she also has an extensive international exposure in terms of where all she's been going and talking and sharing her ideas. For example, the University of Reading in the United Kingdom, and she's also been to the very reputed World Finance Conference at Rio de Janeiro. I don't think that I'll be able to really mention everything about her because there's a lot really there. But certainly what one can see is that we have a speaker with a rich experience, not just in teaching, but also in terms of practices in her area. And today she's going to talk to us about Indian economy. So ma'am, the platform is all yours now.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible to everyone before I start.
Yeah, because we are connecting to you online, so you're audible to us, so should be to others as
well. Great, right. So good afternoon, everyone, and happy to be here. And my thanks to the organizing team for having me here. So initially, when I signed up for this, I thought it would be a face-to-face interaction, and that is what it was planned to be. But then I got a message the other day from Meenakshi ji that probably today would be an online session. So unfortunately, I couldn't be there, with all of you, and probably a face-to-face discussion would have been more engaging. But nevertheless, I would try my best to share my thoughts on the topic that has been assigned to me, which is economic policy of India and evolving dimensions. Honestly, this is such a broad topic that there's no way I can, in 1.5 hours, I can tell you about how economic policy has evolved in India over decades. So my effort really would be to focus on some specific aspects of economic policy, which, in general, people may find interesting. So we all know, when we say economic policy, there is so much which comes under it. Policy related to industries, manufacturing, foreign trade policy, monetary policy, fiscal, so many. It's all encompassing. But I would want to focus on a few things, and these few aspects have become even more relevant during the last 2 years. When we were struck with the pandemic, when the entire global economy has, been devastated by what has happened in the last 2 years. So policy making in these times is no easy task. There are conflicting forces which are there, and then it's a very tightrope walk for any economy, not just for India, for any country, to have that right balance. So this is what I intend actually cover, and I'll be happy to have more time for discussion so that we can exchange ideas and thoughts and views about things. So, so the things which, so when I was thinking about what I talk to everyone about, I think one aspect which is relevant for practically everyone is inflation, price rise. Another thing which has become important is international trade, because the dynamics have changed globally because of the pandemic. So maybe if I get time, I'll touch upon that as well. And so these are 2, 3 things, and a lot of interrelated things within these two aspects is what I plan to talk about. So where does India stand presently if we talk of economics, or the economic policy, or India's positioning vis-a-vis other countries of the world? We stand on a fairly solid footing, so to say, if I put it very generally. How can we say that? Because if we look at the estimates, the IMF, when it comes out with its World Economic Outlook, the most recent projection, it says India is projected to grow at 8.5% in 2022, which is the highest among major economies of the world. Even China, for China, it is projected at 5.6% during the same period. Last year also, the projections were good for India. So, in general, we enjoy strong macroeconomic fundamentals, as we say, compared to a lot of other countries in the world. Now, more recently, so when we talk about COVID-19 and how it has impacted the economies, this crisis has been very unique in terms of the fact that it is both a supply side and a demand side crisis. So normally when we hear recessions or crises, they normally occur from one side. There's a problem on the supply side, or there's a problem on the demand side. But the interesting or the unique thing about this particular crisis was that we were facing problems on both sides. So people's incomes are falling, people are losing jobs because of the pandemic, so there's a demand side problem. At the same time, there are disruptions because factories were closed down. There were weekend curfews, or there were lockdowns in so many countries, so there was a supply side crisis as well. So economic policy had to deal with both these dimensions simultaneously, which made the task very difficult. Now, one of the things which emerged out of all this was the problem of inflation, or price rise, as we call it. So in economics, normally when we talk about inflation, we say a moderate bit of inflation is always good for an economy. So any economy does not always target price fixity. So we also, for every economy, it's good to have a moderate rate of inflation so that the demand grows. And we are targeting growth and development through a growth in demand. But now what happened was 2 years of COVID-19, it led to the emergence of high rate of inflation in many economies of the world. Turkey reached 36.1% in December last year, which was its highest since 2 decades. US touched an all-time high of 7.9%. Nearer home, we had Sri Lanka, which recorded 14.2% in January 2022. Pakistan recorded an inflation of 12.3% in December 2021. And as far as India is concerned, the latest data, which was released by the National Statistical Office on February 14, revealed 6.01% inflation, which is marginally above the 6% upper limit that is set by the RBI. So the situation is not alarming for us at the moment. Now, since we are discussing economic policy, so what are India's arrangements to keep inflation rates within tolerable limits so that we can ward off double-digit inflation? So I'll touch upon a few aspects, where our policy works towards that. One is we have inflation targeting in the country. So prior to 2016, RBI was, the main job of the RBI was to regulate issue of bank notes and keeping of reserves with a view to secure monetary stability. Thereafter, we had an amendment in the RBI Act in 2016, where the RBI Act now provides that the primary objective of our monetary policy is to maintain price stability while keeping in mind the objective of growth. So the amendment in the RBI Act says that the government, in consultation with the RBI, should set or should provide for inflation targets once in every 5 years. And the idea behind this exercise was that the government and the RBI should be on the same page and they should set their targets. So like, for example, beginning 1st April 2021, the inflation target was set at 4% per annum, with tolerance levels of plus minus 2% for the next 5 years, which meant the lower tolerance level at 2% and the higher at 6%. So we have to align our monetary policy in such a way that we meet these targets for the next 5 years. And thankfully, the rate of inflation, maybe, I mean, it's not alarming, but it's a little worrisome that we have moved a little away, 0.01% from our targeted measure. So inflation targeting was an important part of the change that we saw in the economic policy. Then also this amendment which was made in the RBI Act, it provided for a monetary policy committee, which was constituted by the government to oversee the implementation of the inflation target. So normally the MPC or the committee will, perform tasks related to fixing of repo rates so that inflation is in control, and use other instruments of monetary policy. So I don't want to count to economics based here, but generally the other instruments of monetary policy to be taken care of through this committee. So inflation targeting was one important reform, I would say, in the economic policy, whereby the government and the RBI will work in tandem with each other so as to ensure reasonable levels of inflation in the economy. So when you think prices are rising, well, let's control money supply through various instruments so that people have less money in their hands. And when we think there is a need for growth, like, for example, during the pandemic times, a lot of industries, a lot of establishments had to temporarily close down. So to put the economy back on track, development track, it is important to increase money supply so that people have more money in their hands and they spend more. And we are put back on the growth track. So this is how it works. It works on the demand side. But as I said, the last 2 years was not just a demand side problem. It was also a supply side problem. So we had lockdowns, we had curfews, we had disruption of economic activity. So many things happened. Establishments closed down. So it was important for the government not just to boost demand on one side, but also to see that supply is parallelly increasing. Because otherwise what happens is, if we are not able to deal with supply and we move towards increasing demand, prices will rise because the supply is the same. So the challenge was to increase supply as well, along with increasing demand. So our economic policy has looked at that factor as well. And therefore, we have been seeing a lot of supply side reforms in the last 2 years, particularly. So you might have heard about deregulation of sectors, simplification of processes, privatization of public sector enterprises like Air India, and a very flagship scheme of the government, which is known as the PLI scheme, which is the production linked incentive scheme of the government. So I'll delve a bit on the PLI scheme because I think this is a very, very important reform which is happening in India. So if I, sort of digress a bit, I have worked in the area of FDI. That's primarily what I work on. So my PhD and my research work, I work on foreign direct investment and trade. So what we used to initially, the days when I was doing my PhD, there was a lot of I used to read a lot of literature on comparison of India and China and FDI in India and China. And what we used to observe was China, so despite the fact that the countries are roughly at the same level of development, they liberalize roughly at the same time, and other things which were common, China used to attract a lot of FDI as compared to India. 7 times, 6 times, 5 times, something like that. The figure kept on changing over a period of time. And so there was a lot of literature which talked about why China always attracts more FDI than what India does. And where are we going wrong? We have also liberalized, we have also allowed FDI into the country. So apart from a lot of factors responsible for this, one factor which I used to find common across a lot of papers was scaling, which means the capacity, the scale on which a country can produce. And the observation was that the scale at which Chinese firms can produce is much, much higher than the scale at which firms in India can produce. So wahan pe large scale manufacturing, that was their USP. So consequently, what happens is when it's a multinational company and they are, suppose hypothetically speaking, they have to choose between India and China. Any multinational company, if it has to supply to the world, either through India or through China, they will supply through China, because in China, they can engage in large scale production. China has the necessary infrastructure, they have the necessary logistics, they have the necessary supply chain efficiencies. So that scale advantage which China used to offer to these companies was much higher than what we could get in India, where there were various reasons. In India, for example, a large part of our corporations belong to the MSME sector, the micro, small, and medium enterprises who don't, probably either have the resources or the necessary motivation to produce at a very large scale. So that resulted in a lot of MNCs going to China. Now, what happened subsequently was the last 2 years, when the pandemic happened, a lot of reshuffling took place. So, we all know how China's reputation suffered a dent, and, there were multinationals who wanted to move out of China, look for alternative locations to China. And here was where, we had to work on developing India as a suitable alternative to China. So one of the main factors that we needed to work on was scaling. तो जब हम large scale पे produce करते हैं कोई भी चीज, तो उसकी economies होती हैं, per unit cost decreases and production becomes more efficient. So now the challenge was how to get companies to produce on a large scale, on such a large scale that the MNCs find it attractive to engage companies in India. So one step in this direction was the PLI scheme of the government, and we call that the Production Linked Incentive Scheme. So the government says that companies have to meet certain criteria to avail of this incentive. And if they are able, from the base year, if they increase their sales by a certain amount as set by the government, then they are incentivized. So the government will give them a direct incentive, 4 to 6% of sales or something like that. Incentives are different for different sectors. So that is where the idea was, boost domestic manufacturing in strategic sectors, sunrise sectors, so that we improve the cost competitiveness of domestically manufactured goods. So as of now, 14 sectors have been selected under the scheme. So sectors include pharma products, electronics, medical devices, mobile manufacturing, telecommunications. There is a component of chemicals, automobiles, etc. So there are incentives which range from 4 to 6% on incremental sales over the base year, which is set. So it's like a subsidy, which is provided by direct payment. And both domestic and foreign companies are availing of incentives under the PLI scheme. We have data which is available on the internet regarding this, how many sectors covered and what is the entry. And so I guess this is the these are the reforms which are taking place on the supply side, so that apart from increasing demand, the government is also working on increasing supply in various sectors so that it doesn't result in inflation. And at the same time, we make India more competitive, and more competitive both in terms of exports as well as attracting companies into the country. So this is, this is one side of economic policy reforms that we are witnessing these days. Another dimension which has become very important, and it's becoming a lot more important with every passing day, is the foreign trade and foreign policy dimension. So I will touch upon foreign trade more because I've been dealing with that. But otherwise, I mean, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we know that foreign policy has also become so important. And it is such a tightrope walk, particularly if you look at India's position. It's not an easy task to, to take a position, actually. And now that we are facing a lot of pressure from US also, to not be unequivocal. But anyways, I would come to the economic aspect really of it. So a lot of interesting dimensions are unfolding. International trade is important for us because many changes have happened in the last 2 years. And these changes have been challenges as well as opportunities. That's the interesting part about it. So yes, there were challenges, and yes, we have got some opportunities out of these challenges. So when we look at international trade, primarily exports and imports, we learned a lot of things in the last 2 years. India learned a lot of things in the last 2 years. So जैसे हम लोग, since 90s, there is a lot of talk about globalization. Globalization integrate with world economies. It's good. I mean, globalization per se is a good exercise. So what we observed was multinational corporations around the world, they are setting up units in China, they are setting up units in India, emerging economies, Thailand, Vietnam, etc. India on its part was dependent on so many other countries for its imports. And so truly global world we had. But when COVID-19 struck, a lot of things we sort of realized. For example, since I'm talking of international trade, the first lesson that we learned from COVID-19 was the significance of having a diversified export basket. So we saw that a lot of countries which depended only on a few commodities, like the oil exporting countries, तो वो पहला साल जो pandemic का रहा, उसमें they suffered a lot because the economies were largely dependent upon oil, and there was no demand for oil when everything closed down. So the economy suffered. Similarly, we saw economies which were too dependent on tourism, hospitality, etc. They also suffered a lot because there was practically no tourism happening for 1.5 years. So a lot of establishments had to close down. Therefore, it is important that a country should not be too dependent on only one or two goods or services as their items of export. Thankfully, for India, we have a pretty diversified export basket. So we have a list of commodities which are important items of our export, and therefore we have worked on it even more. So although we have a lot of technology intensive exports, which are the dominant exports of India, I think there is a need to boost exports in those sectors also where India as a country has an inherent competitive advantage, because we are a labor abundant country. So it's a good idea that we are exporting capital goods, we are exporting technology intensive products, but it will also be a good idea if we start we are already engaging in exports of cotton, carpets, textiles, but we need to work more on that. These are commodities where we have an inherent advantage, being a labor abundant country. So that was, that's one thing where we have been working on. The other aspect of the policy, which we have been hearing for quite some time, is the Atmanirbhar Bharat program of the government, the Self-Reliant India program. So why did we feel the need to become self-reliant? This was also, an interesting insight that we got during the pandemic. So I'll illustrate this with an example. India is one of the, or probably the largest manufacturer of generic medicines in the world. And very recently, it was also pointed out that we are, in terms of vaccine supply, the largest supplier of vaccine in the world as well. So that's our advantage. We do very well in terms of providing generic medicines to the world. And, in many papers, they call India as the pharmacy of the poor. So for the poorer countries who cannot afford very expensive medical solutions or medicines, we provide generic medicines. So we were doing well in the generic medicines industry and became the largest supplier of generic medicines in the world. However, while the medicines are manufactured in India, the raw material for these medicines, which we call as the APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredients, they used to be provided by China. So what happened was, when supplies from China got disrupted because of the coronavirus, we couldn't proceed with a large-scale manufacturing of these generic medicines because our supply from China was disrupted. And we were dependent on China for these raw materials. So it was at this point in time that the government announced an incentive package and assigned a few thousand crore rupees for firms to start manufacturing raw materials in India. So raw materials, or APIs as we call them. So firms which were doing it at a smaller scale, they got a lot of incentive. And now, within a period of 1.5 years, the manufacturing of raw materials for generic medicines has grown tremendously. So what have we worked towards? We have worked towards self-reliance. So the idea of this whole, Atmanirbhar Bharat program that we talk about was precisely the fact that economies have to redefine their critical sectors. And once you identify your critical sectors, you need to reduce your dependence on other countries during these times. So we saw that despite being the largest supplier of generic medicines, we imported a substantial part of raw materials from China. So there was a need to develop self-reliance. So this was one example, but then there are a lot of other sectors where we need to do that. For example, defense. Defense is a sector which is so strategic from the point of view of security of the country. And for the past so many years, so many decades, 60 to 70% of our defense requirements we import from other countries, which, so I incidentally used to go every year to National Defense College for talking on FDI. And the one common question which I was always asked there was, why doesn't the government increase FDI limit for the defense sector? So we had people from the defense background there, and they always felt that, by importing so much of your defense equipment from others, you are making yourself so vulnerable to these countries. I mean, we can look at our position today. So we cannot go against, for example, we cannot take a position anti-Russia at the moment because we are importing a lot of defense equipment from them, apart from the fact that we've got, strategic ties with them as well. So that is what, and for a good long period of time, the FDI policy did not allow raising the ceiling in the sector, because they said it is going, if we allow foreigners to come and have a majority stake in the country, that will compromise our security. But the fact is, the security is even more compromised when we import from outside. So tomorrow, if our relations go bad with a country, we are not assured of supply of defense equipment. However, on the other hand, if we raise the ceiling in FDI, which has been raised more recently, in that case, that's a long-term thing. So we have a foreign company which comes into India, which invests millions of dollars here, sets up an establishment, starts manufacturing defense equipment in partnership with an Indian entity. You are making yourself less vulnerable, because it's not easy to pull out investment, but it's much easy to stop exports to a country. So this is what I always used to say there also, that yes, there is a need to raise the ceiling, and it has been raised. And apart from raising the FDI ceiling, we have a lot of changes being made in the policy to encourage manufacturing in the defense sector. So we have a full policy document on that. So this was the idea of self-reliance, which was again a lesson we learned. Now, since this is the theme that I was given was evolving policy dimensions. So we have actually come full circle, in the sense that when India got independence, so the initial industrial policy resolutions, if you look at the first 5 year, first, second, third, 5-year plans, it was about industrialization. It was about import substitution. So import substitution, when we used to talk about, the idea again was that manufacture within the country. So we started with that. Then we moved on to export substitution. Then we moved on to liberalization and globalization. And in a way, we have taken that circle and somewhat, arrived at a position where, again, we are saying that now, we should stop too much liberalization and instead focus on developing self-reliance in some of these sectors. So that is how the policy has evolved and come full circle in a certain way. Although it's not exactly the same, because yes, we want globalization as well. So this was, one interesting insight which I observed in these 2 years. Then, since we are talking about international trade, so a lot of segments from the industry, from the academics, they talk about global supply chain. So why India is not a part of the global supply chain, which means that, so becoming a part of the global supply chain simply means that a company A splits up its production into, let's say, 4 stages. So from procuring inputs to adding value to assembly to adding some more value and so on and so forth. So multinationals, what they have been doing is, rather than carrying out all the operations in one country, they divide production into phases, into parts, where one part is carried out in one country, second part in another country, third assembly in another country, and so on and so forth, depending upon which country offers you the lowest cost. Now, when the company chooses a country, let's say for stage 1, they choose Thailand. For stage 2, they choose Vietnam. For stage 3, they choose China, and so on and so forth. Once a country gets integrated into this, it's very beneficial for the country, because the company will not be able to supply to the rest of the world till it, crosses that stage in your country. तो अगर मोबाइल फोन है और उसका अगर हम बोले थर्ड स्टेज है और उसका असेंबली सारा इंडिया में होता है, फॉर एग्जांपल, they cannot supply to the world till they route it through India. So you become an indispensable part of the supply chain, and they can't do without you. That's what China worked on, and that's what they achieved. However, things changed. So when disruptions happened in China because of the coronavirus pandemic, many companies, they started pulling out their firms from China. and they started looking for either an alternative location or going back to their own country. So these were the two alternatives which were there. And therefore, here is where India was looking at a window of opportunity. But it was a big challenge because we were positioning ourselves against very attractive destinations like Vietnam, like Bangladesh, like Thailand. However, now with the measures that we have talked about in terms of PLI, logistics, infrastructure, etc., yes, we have to a certain extent exploited and capitalized that opportunity. So we have a lot of firms which have been coming here. So that integration with the global supply chain is now an important part of our economic policy. And that's what we are working on. So, so that was policy regarding inflation, policy regarding international trade. One bit which I think I would want to talk about, which is very relevant, particularly for the case of a developing country like India, is the empowerment of the MSME sector. So the micro, small and medium enterprises are a very integral part of the whole process. I mean, a large part of manufacturing is being done by them, and they constitute the backbone of the business community. So if we are really looking at export opportunities, large scale production, we have to ensure that there is sufficient connectivity with the MSME sector through forward linkage. So they have to be made a very important part of the manufacturing value chain. They have already suffered a lot because of, in the aftermath of this crisis, issues related to raw material, transportation, labor, so on and so forth. So a stimulus for this sector is, is what is required urgently. And if I talk of economic policy in this direction, yes, there is incentivization happening. So when we were, when I talked of the production linked incentive scheme, PLI scheme, the government has made MSME a separate category. So the threshold which is established for the larger corporations is different from the threshold for MSMEs. It's less for them, and they can still get an incentive. And then, there are things like single investment criterion that we have now, certain changes which have been made in the definition, so on and so forth. So, that's a separate area altogether. So I will probably not be able to get into the MSME dynamics in detail. So this was one aspect of the economic policy that I thought is very topical in these times for India. And one more aspect probably which I will talk about, after which I think we can have more of a discussion round, would be foreign trade agreements of India, a part of the foreign policy actually. So India has FTAs with a lot of countries. We have foreign trade agreements with many nations across the world. The primary purpose of these foreign trade agreements is that if I enter, let's say, into a foreign trade agreement with Japan, the idea is Japan will give concessions to India. It will allow easy access of the Japanese market to Indian goods. And similarly, India will provide concessions to goods coming from Japan and provide them easy access, lesser tariffs, lesser taxes, and so on and so forth. As far as the policy on FTA is concerned, the past experience with FTAs has not been very encouraging. So, if we look at some estimates of the Department of Revenue, we will see that with some of the FTAs, free trade agreements, when we entered into those FTAs, our trade deficit with that country actually increased rather than decreasing post the FTA. So for example, when India enters into a free trade agreement with ASEAN countries or with South Korea or with Japan, so what we saw was that after entering into the free trade agreement, our revenue loss was much higher than what we gained from the FTA. So the trade deficit increased instead of decreasing. And that is because FTAs are not truly reciprocal. There have been a lot of cases where our partner country has extracted more concessions from us than what we have been able to extract from them. So suppose हम लोग अगर if we reduce tariffs, if we provide greater market access to Japanese goods for which there is a demand in India, then they gain a lot by this exercise. However, it's not happening the other way around. So जापान जिन प्रोडक्ट्स में इंडिया को कंसेशन दे रहा है उन प्रोडक्ट्स की डिमांड ही नहीं है जापान में या कम डिमांड है. So consequently, the benefit is not that much for us as it is from them. So we ended up losing more than what we gained from these FTAs. And that is the case with a lot of, with ASEAN countries, with South Korea. That is why India decided not to be a part of RCEP, the RCEP arrangement. Because most of the countries which were there in RCEP, we already have FTAs with them. And we are not gaining much. So very recently, the Commerce and Industry Minister has announced that we are going to renegotiate a lot of our FTAs to India's advantage, to see that the benefits that we are getting from another country should actually translate into more exports or more investment or whatever the case may be. So that is an exercise again, which is being done. So this is very important from the point of view of the gains that we are making by entering into arrangements with the other countries. And lastly, I think a bit about infrastructure policy. So the recent budget has given a lot of push to the infrastructure. So I guess that is also a very important part of the policy, because the availability, again, India-China comparison, whenever we do an India-China comparison, there is a comparison of infrastructure as well. And infrastructure is important, logistics are important, because it's a whole cycle which has to be followed, which has to be efficient for goods to move from India to another country. So by now, it is almost, well agreed by everyone that the availability of efficient, adequate, affordable infrastructure is at the core of development strategy. So that is why we saw this year, the budget, there has been an excessive emphasis on infrastructure and logistics development, so as to prepare the country not just for self-reliance in strategic sectors, but also for exports and competitiveness in these sectors. So there's a huge list of infrastructure projects which was announced in the program under the PM Gati Shakti, the transformative approach that was announced in this year's budget. Apart from the fact that it's important that we do talk about this infrastructure push, social infrastructure is also important. This is physical infrastructure. So social means that we know that almost every sector of the economy and every section of the society has suffered during the pandemic. But the impact has been disproportionate. So migrant workers, daily wages, small-time vendors, a lot of self-employed people, they have been badly hit. So the social infrastructure also needs to be worked at. Like, for example, in the budget, in this regard, for the Mahatma Gandhi National, the MG Narega program, there was a provision which was made for about 73,000 crores, which again is in view of the fact that we need to, a lot of people have moved back to their rural areas, and therefore there is a need to create and generate employment there. So that also needs to be taken care of, and probably the number of guaranteed days of work should also be increased to account for this. So when we talk of infrastructure, it has to be physical and it has to be social infrastructure, so that the benefits of development percolate down to all levels of the society. Therefore, I would say that as we face a great deal of uncertainty in times to come, it is a very testing time for policymakers to show their skills under these conditions. India has, I mean, overall, we have been doing well in terms of anticipating changes in global dynamics, domestic dynamics, and we have reoriented our policies quite proactively to exploit the opportunities that have arisen out of this challenging situation. So, we have achieved a lot in terms of infrastructure, defense production now, IT, pharma, space research, etc. So what the concern at the moment, I guess, is that there are concerns about economic inequalities, the health, the education needs of the marginalized sections of the society. So the socio-economically disadvantaged they are yet to benefit from the economic prosperity. And therefore, probably, which is a very challenging task, the policymakers have to see to it that the growth should make a significant difference to the lives of the poorest and the most vulnerable citizens of the country. And that is the challenge before any government, to evolve a system in which we have reforms, in which there is globalization, which is proceeding on one track. But at the same time, the marginalized sections of the society need to be protected from the ill effects of these reforms, and the benefits of growth need to flow down to these sections of the society as well. So that sounds like the most perfect economic policy, which is not easy to execute, which is a challenge for any government. But yes, that is the ideal way forward. So I guess I would like to close here so that we can probably have more time for discussion and it doesn't get a boring monologue for everyone. So over to the host. I guess I'll take up questions if there are any.
Thank you, Professor Vaseem, for such an interesting session. I think the participant would be able to understand how the economy works and can grow in India in the pandemic situations. Now, as said by the madam, if you have any question, you can ask one by one by raising your hands or writing on the chat box. Any participant?
जी नमस्कार मैडम। मैडम मेरा क्वेश्चन था कि हम आत्मनिर्भर की बात करते हैं तो किस किस क्षेत्रों में अभी सबसे ज्यादा जरूरत है कि हम अपने यहाँ प्रोडक्शन कर सके, किस किस क्षेत्रों में हम दूसरे देशों पर अधिक निर्भर हैं?
तो नॉर्मली जब हम सेल्फ रिलायंस की बात करते हैं या आत्मनिर्भर की बात करते हैं तो हमें सेक्टर्स आइडेंटिफाई करने पड़ते हैं, क्योंकि अक्रॉस द बोर्ड ये एक्सरसाइज नहीं होती है। तो गवर्नमेंट ने 13 या 14 चैंपियन सेक्टर्स जिसको हम बोलते हैं वो आइडेंटिफाई किए हैं। हमने शुरू किया था डिफेंस और फार्मा से। तो फार्मास्यूटिकल हमारे लिए बहुत क्रिटिकल है क्योंकि इंडिया एडवांटेज एंजॉय करता है फार्मास्यूटिकल सेक्टर में। हमारी बहुत सी डोमेस्टिक कंपनीज हैं जो बहुत अच्छा काम कर रही है जेनरिक मेडिसिन में। तो एक वो सेक्टर है जहां पे हमने शुरुआत की थी सेल्फ रिलायंस, जो जैसे मैंने बताया कि रॉ मटेरियल्स के लिए हम डिपेंडेंट थे, तो वहीं से हमने शुरू किया। दूसरा डिफेंस तो वैसे भी किसी भी कंट्री के लिए एक बहुत स्ट्रैटेजिक सेक्टर है क्योंकि हमारे देश की सिक्योरिटी का कंसर्न है वो। तो उसमें जितना हम सेल्फ रिलायंट बने उतना हमारे लिए अच्छा रहता है। उसी तरह कुछ ऐसी सेक्टर्स हैं जहाँ पे इंडिया को एडवांटेज है, जैसे ऑटोमोबाइल सेक्टर है, टेलीकम्युनिकेशंस है, आईटी बेस्ड सेक्टर्स जो हैं, आईटी इनेबल, बिकॉज वी आर अ आईटी हब फॉर अ लॉट ऑफ कंट्रीज। तो हमारे यहाँ जो एक स्किल्स हैं सॉफ्टवेयर बेस्ड, उसको हमें यूज करना चाहिए। तो जिन जिन जगह पे हमारे पास कंपेटिटिव एडवांटेज है, उसको हमें एक्सप्लॉइट करना चाहिए, और वो सेक्टर्स हैं जहाँ पे हमें शुरुआत करनी चाहिए सेल्फ रिलायंस, जहाँ पे हमारी डिपेंडेंस या तो ऑलरेडी कम है, या ऐसे सेक्टर्स जहां हमें नहीं डिपेंड होना, क्योंकि वो हमारे देश के लिए बहुत क्रिटिकल है। तो आई थिंक वहां से हम तो अगर आप वो देखेंगे इन्वेस्ट इंडिया वेबसाइट, या एक DPIIT, डिपार्टमेंट ऑफ प्रमोशन फॉर इंडस्ट्री एंड इंटरनल ट्रेड, ये मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ कॉमर्स के अंडर आता है, उसमें उन्होंने दिया हुआ है कि जो अभी PLI स्कीम है वो कौन कौन से सेक्टर्स के लिए इंट्रोड्यूस की गई है। तो PLI एक इनिशिएटिव है टुवर्ड्स सेल्फ रिलायंस, आत्मनिर्भर बनाने के लिए उसे। तो वहां पे हम डिटेल्स देख सकते हैं उसकी।
थैंक यू मैडम।
और कोई पार्टिसिपेंट? किसी और पार्टिसिपेंट्स का कोई क्वेश्चन है?
हाँ जी सर। हेलो मैम।
हेलो
मैम, thank you so much for sharing all this information. I think this was very helpful. I feel, ma'am, so there is one sector called consumer electronics, where I am sure there are some PLI scheme which has been launched for those 13 sectors. But do you think if government can work upon some trade incentives? I mean, as China has, whenever they have to export a lot of items, I think they kind of work around the taxes and other schemes in order to get the export things, in a more cheap way, and probably in a way where they can export the items. Do you think that kind of policy would work and raise the export from India for consumer electronics?
yes, that definitely would work, and they are aligning it with that. तो एक हमारा सेक्टर है इलेक्ट्रॉनिक्स एंड इलेक्ट्रिकल कंपोनेंट्स जो इसके अंदर आता है। तो जब हम imports rationalization, when we talk about it, so the idea is self-reliant doesn't mean that we raise tariffs on all products which are coming from other countries. We have to be very selective. So when you say consumer electronics or electrical components, if we want self-reliance in this sector, for example, and then our manufacturers are dependent on components from somewhere else, so we should not increase duties on those components. So get the components, for the final product which is being imported, we can increase duties on that. So this process is called as import rationalization, which means India doesn't have to block everything from coming into India. Raise tariffs for final products which you don't want here, so that the domestic manufacturer is encouraged. Lower tariffs for raw materials which the manufacturer needs, so that he can produce it at a lower cost. So we are following that policy also. Baki abhi the government has come up with road remission of taxes and duties ka ek naya paper aaya hai government ka. तो उसमें they are taking care of the fact that these duties are remitted during the production process, which is taking place by the domestic manufacturers. Yes.
Thank you, ma'am.
Anyone else has a question? Ji, Meena ji, please.
Ma'am, I want to about the Indian economy, how it due to COVID-19 pandemic, Indian economy, how much affected and how it would be reformed again.
Okay, so that's generally this is what I talked about. So we have been affected both positively and negatively. So negatively, to everyone has been affected. We all know that when the pandemic struck, exports fell, investment fell, domestic activity decreased. So that was for all economies of the world, that they were negatively affected. The positive for India is that we have identified opportunities in these challenges. तो वो हमारा positive रहा. For example, investment की terms में, we have been able to shift some investment from China into India through policies on manufacturing, through policies on foreign trade, etc. So we got an opportunity there. उसी तरह से जब when manufacturing suffered, that is when the policy reform took place कि अब हमें manufacturing को और self reliance को encourage करना है country में. If coronavirus would not have happened, probably these steps would not have been taken because things were working in a certain fashion. But अब जब when we are struck with a crisis, तो फिर रिफॉर्म हुआ और हमें लगा कि नहीं, अपने डोमेस्टिक यूनिट्स को हमें लार्ज स्केल मैन्युफैक्चरिंग में एंगेज करना है, not only for our own self reliance but also to attract companies into India so that they manufacture in India and supply to the rest of the world from there. तो बहुत से upheavals हुए हैं, लेकिन अगर हम इंडिया को बाकी कंट्रीज से कंपेयर करें, बाकी इमर्जिंग इकोनॉमीज, इवन विद अ लॉट ऑफ डेवलप्ड कंट्रीज, हमारी पोजीशन फिर भी बहुत रोबस्ट रही है कंपेयर टू अ लॉट ऑफ अदर कंट्रीज. हमारे इकोनॉमिक फंडामेंटल्स स्ट्रॉन्ग रहे हैं, हमारे फॉरेक्स रिजर्व स्ट्रॉन्ग रहे हैं इस टाइम पे, जो बहुत अनयूजुअल है फॉर अ टाइम व्हेन वी आर फेसिंग अ क्राइसिस लाइक दिस. सो काफी रेजिलियंस दिखाई है इंडियन इकोनॉमी ने, एंड थैंकफुली वी आर सॉर्ट ऑफ गेटिंग बैक ऑन ट्रैक. द प्रोजेक्शंस, I mean, for India they are much better than for a lot of our neighboring countries. So I hope with an appropriate policy environment and with appropriate reforms in place, definitely there is a lot India can gain from this challenge.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Anyone else has a question? I can see a hand being raised there. Yeah. Oh, that's from us only by mistake. जी महेंद्र जी, हमने गलती से यहाँ पे हाथ उठा दिए हैं जी. Anyone else who has a question?
Yes, ma'am. मैं पुष्पा ऑनलाइन. हाँ, मैं पुष्पा, है ना मैम. मैं ये पूछना चाहती हूँ कि हम बहुत ज्यादा ग्लोबलाइजेशन, इंडस्ट्रियलाइजेशन की बात करते हैं, और हम ये भी जानते हैं कि लाइक हमारे जो एग्रीकल्चर सेक्टर है वो हमारे रेवेन्यू का और हमारे बहुत बड़ा पार्ट है, और इंडस्ट्री से जो हम कहते हैं, तो फिर हम क्यों नहीं उसको ज्यादा डेवलप करते हैं? गवर्नमेंट अभी तक सिंस द इंडिपेंडेंट अभी भी कुछ भी नहीं हुआ है उसमें, और प्रोग्रेस भी नहीं दिखती, लेकिन जबकि अभी भी उसका मेजर पार्ट हमारा रेवेन्यू का होता है जो इंडस्ट्री से हमें मिलती है. तो उस पे आप कुछ हमें समझाएंगे?
जी बिल्कुल. एग्रीकल्चर तो वैसे ही बहुत ही इंटरेस्टिंग सेक्टर है हमारे कंट्री के लिए. नहीं, अगर हम जीडीपी में कंट्रीब्यूशन की बात करते हैं तो एग्रीकल्चर का कंट्रीब्यूशन अभी सबसे कम है. लार्जेस्ट जीडीपी कंट्रीब्यूटर है सर्विसेज सेक्टर, फॉलोड बाय मैन्युफैक्चरिंग, फॉलोड बाय एग्रीकल्चर. और अगर हम ये देखें कि कितने लोग एंगेज्ड हैं एग्रीकल्चर में, तो सबसे ज्यादा है. रफली 2/3 ऑफ आवर पॉपुलेशन इज एंगेज्ड इन एग्रीकल्चर, और फिर बाकी सेक्टर्स का आता है. तो वो दो चीजें मैच नहीं करती, क्योंकि आपकी एम्प्लॉयमेंट सबसे ज्यादा वहां है, लोग एंगेज्ड हैं, लेकिन कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशन सबसे कम एग्रीकल्चर का है. राइट. तो अभी जो फोकस था वो पहले तो ये था कि हमारे सर्विसेज सेक्टर ने बहुत अच्छा डेवलप करा, और एक टाइम अभी भी आई थिंक 50% से ज्यादा कंट्रीब्यूशन जीडीपी में उसी का है. हाउएवर लॉन्ग टर्म में सिर्फ सर्विसेज पे हम कहते हैं कि इकोनॉमी को सस्टेन करना मुश्किल होता है, इसलिए मैन्युफैक्चरिंग इंपॉर्टेंट है. तो फिर हमने सेल्फ रिलायंस, आत्मनिर्भर भारत, मेक इन इंडिया, ये सब प्रोग्राम्स किए. एग्रीकल्चर में डेफिनेटली रिफॉर्म्स की जरूरत है, लेकिन एग्रीकल्चर को सिर्फ एक इकोनॉमिक पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से नहीं देखा जाता. That is a problem. We have witnessed, हमें पिछले 1-1.5 साल में काफी कुछ देख लिया. तो जब भी कुछ रिफॉर्म करने की कोशिश की जाती है एग्रीकल्चर सेक्टर में, तो बहुत से और इंटरेस्ट्स हैं जो कॉन्फ्लिक्टिंग इंटरेस्ट्स हैं. तो अभी हालांकि हम फार्म बिल्स की बात नहीं, दिस इज नॉट द एरिया वेयर आई एम डिस्कसिंग, बट दैट्स व्हाट हैपेंड. तो उसमें बहुत से रिफॉर्म्स थे जो प्रोग्रेसिव थे, लेकिन बिकॉज देयर वर वेस्टेड इंटरेस्ट्स, उनको आगे नहीं ले जाया गया. बहुत से देश हैं जहां पे एग्रीकल्चर को उसी तरह ट्रीट किया जाता है जैसे आप किसी कमर्शियल सेक्टर को ट्रीट करते हैं. यहाँ हम नहीं करते, क्योंकि हमें पता है कि a lot of people who are poor are engaged in agriculture. But at the same time, if you want to reform the sector, और उसमें कुछ बहुत अच्छे रिफॉर्म्स भी थे, but they couldn't be executed. लैंड जो है वो एक स्टेट, बहुत सी चीजें एग्रीकल्चर में जो स्टेट सब्जेक्ट है. तो जब स्टेट्स का रोल आ जाता है तो वहां पे एक अलग कंपेटिटिव वो, everything doesn't come under the center. तो बिकॉज वो स्टेट सब्जेक्ट हो जाता है, तो इसलिए वहां पे कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स बहुत ज्यादा हो जाते हैं. तो उस वजह से it becomes difficult to push through a lot of reforms in this sector. और उसका we witnessed that, and the laws had to be repealed So इसलिए हम अभी नहीं कर पा रहे हैं. Maybe in future we can keep on working on that, and maybe at some point in time agriculture भी उसी तरह reform हो पाए जिस तरह हम manufacturing को कर पाए हैं. But I guess अभी time लगेगा उसमें. From what we have seen. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Any other question for Professor Bhasin? Any other question from participants? Well, doesn't seem like, although there are so many, I mean, obviously economy is something which is always such a dynamic thing. Things sort of keep happening. So Professor Bhasin, I'm so sorry. I so wanted to listen through your lecture, but when in the middle of, I'm also a teacher here at the university. I'm in the middle of another meeting which is going on, and that's why I had to juggle between this and
No
that.
worries.
So are you? So are you through with your lecture? Is it? Or there's?
Yes, I thought I'm done with done in the sense that I thought this much absorption of economic policy would be good enough. There are so many other areas I want to maybe I can touch upon, but I'm not too sure if it's a good idea to put too many things at the same time. So that's why I thought if anyone wants to delve on these areas, we can always talk.
Yeah, and maybe we can mention to Professor Bhasin as to which area you might want to, because she's an expert. So which area we might want to want her to talk a little bit about. Maybe that's a good sort of way to understand things. Which area would you want her to maybe talk a little bit on? Participants? Okay, we Zoom user. So Mr. Zoom user, can you please also mention your name, Mr. or Madam? जी, नाम बता दीजिएगा अपना. जी, Zoom user जी, आप बोल सकते हैं.
Ma'am, I have a question.
Yeah.
आप कौन सुमित अरोड़ा कौन है?
Dipin Arora.
अच्छा,
Okay, I'll update my name. Okay, I'm sorry. I'll update my name. Madam, my question is that in the initial part of your lecture, you mentioned that inflation last year in India is under 7%, 6 point something. But at the ground level, we see that prices have increased a lot. So how this inflation is calculated basically?
All right. So we use the consumer price index. The retail inflation is India's benchmark for inflation. So that is what is used. So the National Statistical Organization comes out with its measures of inflation. And CPI, the consumer price index, is used for that purpose. जिसको popularly हम retail inflation बोलते हैं. So that is India's benchmark measure of inflation. तो जब हम inflation targeting भी करते हैं, when we set targets for inflation, it is done in terms of retail inflation only. So when we say 4% with a plus minus 2% tolerance level, that is the one that we are using. Yeah.
Yes, others.
Thank you.
Hey, ma'am. Niti ma'am, can you touch upon maybe AI thing? I mean, what's gonna be the future? Because I mean, we've been listening a lot of stories about AI and probably data science, to be specific. So considering this will have both manufacturing and service industry together. Do you think? I mean, what's going to be the contribution in future towards the GDP and sector-specific growth which we are anticipating?
Well, so AI is not my specialization. I know as much about AI as probably all of you know. Yeah, it's the technology of the future. It's something which is going to be there. All I can say is, yes, so we have to embrace technology. We have witnessed a digital revolution. We'll have to embrace this technology as well. All we have to keep in mind is that, yes, we are a labor abundant country. So we have to think of reskilling people. So it's not that technology is going to replace people, but we need adequate reskilling of our labor force so that they're in a position to use this technology. I remember, when I was a student, We had similar when they were thinking of going for computerization in banks and making everything, at that time, though, those were the times when in banks things were done manually, and then the government decided everything will be computerized. And so there was a lot of debate about why this is happening, and a lot of people will be out of jobs because of this. So we used to hear speakers at that time as well, and they said there is going to be a short-term disturbance which might happen, but eventually it will increase jobs. And that's what we saw. So in a bank where probably 5 people or 6 people working in a branch, we had 10 people because the range of services increased. There was a reskilling which was happening, and all that led to creation of jobs rather than displacement of jobs. So, well, I hope the same for AI as well. AI is inevitable. We cannot, move without taking that into consideration. So we just have to be more proactive, and we just have to start already working on reskilling our labor force. The students who are coming out of colleges, the university has to take it upon itself to impart skills to our students in such a way that they should be in a position to take this up and take associated jobs. So I guess that is where the work needs to be done. Other than that, the technical part, I am not an expert on AI. Yeah. From an economy point of view, this is what I can say.
Just one small point, ma'am, because I have had a couple of discussion on this very area, and I was being told that probably Western countries, they are actually curbing on the migrant labor, and that's where there is a lot of AI, work happening towards AI in order to probably have restaurants without any labor involved or the chefs involved. But the country which is like India as a country where we have abundant labor, probably reskilling would take place eventually, right? That's going to be the future. But do you think just immediately copying it and probably placing it in India would immediately create a situation of a panic wherein a lot of people have left, probably lost their jobs in maybe if we can use AI for major work rather than kind of just picking up in the area it has already started moving to.
Yeah,
I think that would have.
I guess I don't see too much of a problem there, because overall economic policy of India, if I go whatever decades back I go, 6, 5, whatever, we have followed a very calibrated approach most of the time. I have never whatever little I have read on economic policy and whatever I've seen, I don't think we have been very reckless with our policies. We have moved in a very cautious, calibrated way. The same is going to hold for this also. So when we do take up an exercise, yeah, we already have faceless communication happening in a lot of stores in America. It has not still come to India though. Normally what we observe is with such not just for stores, otherwise also with a lot of industries which are using AI, ancillary services pick up and jobs get created in those ancillary sectors. So if we have a drone doing a particular job, then there has to be a monitoring which also needs to be done with regard to that drone, and probably there the role of the skilled worker would come into place. Second, India, we have a dual economy here. So it's not just about capital intensive high-tech products. We have a huge amount of population which is engaged in traditional sectors as well, which are labor abundant. Cotton, textiles, carpets, a lot of handloom, a lot of agriculture. So those are going to, these are sectors which engage a lot of people. And we don't see much happening in terms of AI in these sectors, at least in the immediate future. So I guess, no, it should not be too much of a problem with the kind of history we have in terms of following the calibrated approach to changes and reforms.
Yes, any other participants? Participant has a question. Otherwise, here, Mr. Akhilesh Jha has a question. Yes, Jhaji, please.
Ma'am, as you have already said, the pandemic has also brought an opportunity for the India. We are very low on the inflation side, very high on the growth side as projected by the World Bank or IMF also. But in spite of all these measures, and just you said, we have considerably made self-sufficient in pharmaceutical industry, and the defense industry is also one of the core area where we are going to be self-sufficient. We have started the process, but in spite of all these things, inflation remains the low, projections of growth is high. In spite of that, but Parmanji asked, we are not able to generate that numbers of employment in the India. Even if we will see it is highest in the last 30 to 40 years. So why there is such a contradiction in that?
Right. So, so the employment numbers, there are multiple estimates of employment numbers which are available. Now, there are two things. One is there is a huge amount of unemployment which has been created because of the last 2 years of the pandemic. There has been a reverse migration of people who are working in urban areas, they've gone back to rural areas. Now suddenly they can't find jobs in rural areas as well because there is limited capability and capacity there. So a lot of that happened. There were lockdowns, there were curfews, many people lost jobs. So there has been, this is across countries. This is not something specific to India. Because what happened, because of these disruptions which happened during the last 2 years, a lot of establishments, they had to close down in a lot of countries. So in the midterm, and unemployment is bound to rise because economic activity took a hit. I mean, employment gets generated only when there's demand, when there's growth, when economic activity is happening. So we have hotels and we have restaurants complaining because obviously they were shut down. Where are they going to get their revenue from? Now, when these establishments shut down, so many other people who are related, whether it's the caterers, whether it's other vendors, they also lose jobs in the process. But this was an unavoidable situation. We could not have opened it because there were restrictions in place. So that has created this short-term disturbance. However, and when we say reforms and policies, they will take their own time. We have started, working on improving economic activity. Things have started opening up, and economic activity, when it's back on track, we should expect some of this to come back to employment. At the same time, however, a lot of जो reverse migration हुआ labor का और जो people went back to their villages, वहाँ पे अभी भी unemployment बहुत ज़्यादा है. Many of them are not willing to come back to urban areas. So that is another problem we are dealing with. So probably schemes like Narega, MG Narega is where we can work on, where we can ensure that some guarantee of minimum days of work or wages to the workers. So Abhi, there is already a demand that from 100 days it should be increased to 150 days probably. It's not just about the obviously the allocation has increased for the MG Narega scheme in the budget, but at the same time I think agar wahan pe hum jo number of days guarantee dete hain for scheme usko bhi agar बढ़ा दें तो we can alleviate it to a certain extent. और दूसरी बात ये है कि जो reforms हैं वो by the time it has an impact on employment, it is going to take some time. तो आज अगर हम इंसेंटिवाइज करते हैं एमएसएमई सेक्टर को और वो अपनी स्केलिंग बढ़ाते हैं, अपनी प्रोडक्शन कैपेसिटी बढ़ाते हैं, तो कुछ टाइम के बाद ही उसका इम्पैक्ट एम्प्लॉयमेंट पे दिखना शुरू होगा. तो ये एक, अगर हम एक्सेप्शनल कुछ बात कर रहे हैं, वो एक शॉर्ट टर्म डिस्टर्बेंस है और वो शॉर्ट टर्म डिस्टर्बेंस सभी मोस्ट ऑफ द कंट्रीज हैव फेस्ड इट. तो वी कैन जस्ट होप दैट with changes that will happen, we will be able, क्योंकि हमारा इन्फ्लेशन कंट्रोल में है, रीजनेबल है, बहुत कोई अलार्मिंग सिचुएशन नहीं है, तो शायद हम वो we can work towards generating more employment over the next few months or maybe a few years.
But in India, I think the reforms are going at a very slow speed. In the real sense, when the effect of the reforms is visible, by the time government is reformed.
Yeah, democracy, that's how.
And we work on the public advice or public newspaper. Public is saying, at the moment we are not getting the job and we are very helpless. There is no support from the governments. Government is on the other side saying we are taking the reforms. Let's wait for some time.
Yeah.
We become impatient. In the meantime, the person who has initiated the reform, that is changed. And reforms again remains there.
और फिर वो वापस भी हो जाते हैं कई बार रिफॉर्म्स, ऐसा भी होता है. अब डेमोक्रेसी, ये तो एक डेमोक्रेसी का वो जिसको हम कहते हैं ना पॉलिटिकल रिस्क है, क्योंकि अब जैसे चाइना है, वहां पे तो चेंज होगा नहीं, वहां तो कम्युनिज्म है, तो वो तो जो हो गया सो हो गया। यहाँ पे तो आपने कुछ रिफॉर्म किया तो ये भी लाइकली है कि उस रिफॉर्म को वापस भी लिया जा सकता है कुछ टाइम बाद, इफ देयर इज अ चेंज इन पावर। बट दैट्स व्हाट अ डेमोक्रेसी हैज टू डील विद। तो हम लोग सिर्फ प्रे कर सकते हैं और उम्मीद कर सकते हैं कि अगर रिफॉर्म्स हैं तो वो सही ट्रैक पे चले ताकि सभी को उसका बेनिफिट हो। सो दैट्स द बेस्ट वी कैन होप फॉर।
ओके, थैंक यू
जी। और किसी का कोई सवाल है? कितने तेल के दाम बढ़ने वाले हैं ये पूछना चाहते हैं आप प्रोफेसर भसीन से?
जी
कुछ तो
नमस्ते
बढ़ेंगे
मैडम।
with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, expect some increase. Yeah.
वो तो पहले भी बढ़ रहे थे तो अब तो बढ़ेंगे ही, ऑफ कोर्स।
बिल्कुल, अब तो और डिसरप्शन है। Yes.
जी, आई कैन सी मिस्टर ओम कुमार कर्ण वांट्स टू आस्क यू समथिंग। जी ओम
जी
कुमार जी।
जी जी मैडम, मैं ये पूछ रहा था कि अभी जीएसटी के बारे में कुछ सवाल था कि जीएसटी जो अभी हम लोग देते हैं, तो जीएसटी लगाने के पीछे उद्देश्य ये था कि एक ही बार टैक्स नहीं, कई लोगों से टैक्स नहीं लेना पड़े। लेकिन अभी तो हर चीज में ग्राहक को जो खरीदने वाला है उसको टैक्स देना पड़ता है, तो इससे फायदा तो सिर्फ कंपनी वाले को और दुकान वाले को, बिजनेसमैन को हो रहा है। इसके संबंध में क्या आपका सुझाव है?
वेल ओके, तो जीएसटी में ना अगेन ऐसा कोई स्पेशलाइजेशन नहीं है, बट ये है कि जो आइडिया था जीएसटी को लाने का वो ये था, एक तो अगर हम पूरा साइकिल समझें तो इनपुट टैक्स क्रेडिट भी मिलता है अगर आप जीएसटी पे कर रहे हैं, जो आप यूज कर सकते हैं आगे अपने उसके लिए फॉर शोइंग योर कॉस्ट्स एटसेट्रा। और दूसरा ये था कि मल्टीप्लिसिटी ऑफ टैक्सेस था, तो हमारा जो पुराना इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स स्ट्रक्चर अगर हम देखें बहुत ही कॉम्प्लिकेटेड था विद अ लॉट ऑफ मल्टीप्लिसिटी ऑफ टैक्सेस। तो जीएसटी लाने का एक आइडिया तो ये था कि हम उसको सब्ज्यूम कर लें और सिंप्लीफाई कर दें अपने इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स सिस्टम को। टैक्स हम पहले भी पे करते थे, चाहे वो सेल्स टैक्स की फॉर्म में था या दूसरी किसी भी फॉर्म में था, उसको इंटीग्रेट कर दिया है और स्टेट और सेंटर का शेयर उसमें हमने डिवाइड कर दिया है। तो हाँ, मतलब अब इसमें अगर कुछ सो दिस इज व्हाट आई कैन से एट द मोमेंट, दिस इज it is a progressive reform. उस पे मैं I'm always agreeable to that because for a lot of other countries if we look at it, और particularly जिस तरह के federal structure में इंडिया काम करता है, it is important to have that kind of a demarcation and it is important to have a simplified tax structure. तो कभी हम जब at least when I used to study about this or FDI into India, तो उसमें एक factor जो point out a lot of MNEs would say is that the tax structure is very complicated in India, and that is the reason why a lot of तो अब जो ease of doing business की हम बात करते हैं उसका भी एक important component ये है कि tax structure भी हमारा simplify होना चाहिए। तो GST उसी में आगे it's a progression in that, और more transparency, हमारे revenues बढ़ गए हैं हमारे जो indirect tax के हैं post GST। तो tax payment तो it is a sort of part and duty of all the consumers and taxpayers to provide that revenue to the government. That's all I can say on this.
नहीं, इसमें मैडम ये हो रहा है, मेरा जो जहाँ तक ये अनुमान है कि हम लोग टैक्स पे करते हैं, एक तो हम इनकम टैक्स पे करते हैं सर्विस वाले लोग, उसके बाद जब सामान खरीदते हैं उसमें टैक्स देते हैं।
बिल्कुल।
जो बिजनेसमैन है, अब हर चीज के बिजनेसमैन तो बिल देते नहीं है, और हमारा जीएसटी जो हमने पे किया तो उन्हें तो अलग से कुछ पे नहीं करना पड़ता है टैक्स। जो बिजनेस कर रहे हैं उनका इनकम टैक्स, इनकम कोई पूरा वो,
अगर हम जीएसटी पे करते हैं तो हम उसका बिल लेते हैं
जी।
तो
लेकिन जो सामान, जो घरेलू सामान है उसमें जनरली अब बड़े बड़े मॉल में बिल देते हैं, वैसे छोटे दुकानों में तो बिल होते नहीं है। तो अल्टीमेट जो ग्राहक हैं उन्हीं को पे करना पड़ रहा है, मेरा ये कहना है। बीच में जो बिजनेस है उनको तो टैक्स नहीं देना पड़ता है, ग्राहक पर पूरा जीएसटी का भार आता है।
मैम
जी
मैं क्या ऐड ऑन कर सकता हूँ थोड़ा?
जी जी प्लीज प्लीज।
एक्चुअली मैडम जीएसटी के साथ में टीडीएस भी एप्लीकेबल होता है। कि जो जीएसटी है ये है कि सेलर आप बायर से लिया, गवर्नमेंट को एज इट इज दिया, लेकिन उसको जो उसकी अर्निंग हुई है उस पे टीडीएस भी जमा करना पड़ता है। अगर इंस्टीट्यूशन उसको पे करता है तो टीडीएस इंस्टीट्यूशन काट लेता है, अन्यथा जब वो ITR फाइल करता है, वो अपनी एनुअल इनकम दिखाते हुए TDS फाइल करता है GST के अलग।
राइट। हाँ, वो तो इवन विद
है
अस,
ना। और TDS का जैसे 2% ऐसे इस तरह से अलग अलग रेट्स है मैडम, गुड्स पे अलग है, सर्विसेज पे अलग है, इस तरह की चीजें हैं। तो TDS और GST दोनों डिफरेंट है।
So tax reforms, so that's a separate area of discussion. But yeah, this is whatever little I can say on this. The GST is not my area of expertise, so to say. But yeah, this is all I have to.
लेकिन ऐसा लग रहा है यहाँ बहुत लोगों की दुखती नस है ये, तो इसलिए जो है
टैक्स, हमारा टैक्स तो वैसे ही सबसे पहले कटता है. We are not comparable to business in any case. We get our salary later, the tax is deducted first. So that is a long pending, what should I say, complaint that we have.
अगर टैक्स के बारे में आपको कोई भी जो है कंप्लेन है तो अभी बता सकते हैं. बराड़ साहब है यहाँ पे, वही टैक्स काटते हैं हम सबका. मैं भी उन्हें एक दिन कह रही थी आप बहुत टैक्स काट रहे हो हमारा. So he is also one of the participants.
So this is with all of us, yeah.
So anyway, tax is something I know everybody thinks that there is a lot that we give. Anyway, और कोई सवाल है किसी का? कोई और कुछ और आप कहना चाहते हैं? Okay, let me ask one question. I'm committing a crime by being at two places on the same at the same time. So I'm so sorry for that. That's utterly disgusting. Since we have you here, and I remember you mentioned that you are an expert on FDI. What is the latest on FDI in the media? In the media sector, do you have any idea about that?
Latest as in, there hasn't been any recent policy change as far as media sector is concerned. I don't think any recent announcements have been made with regard to it. Anything specific that you're looking at?
As in, how much is that for example, News Corporation or these big media houses, international media houses, how much stakes can they have in an Indian media company?
I guess 26% is the cap for media houses. In the last I heard, yes, it was 26%. Because again, this is a strategic sector for the country, having too much, just like defense. Here also, the underlying belief is that if we have too much equity of a foreign media house, then that is going to affect the way things are portrayed in international media or in general around the world. So we see a lot of communist countries that do not allow foreign media houses at all to be. So whatever is telecast is only their own domestic media houses. In India, we still allow it, but as far as I remember, 26% is the ceiling for foreign equity. In media houses here, yes. The concern being the same, that it's a strategic sector for the country.
One thing I'd like to ask, is there any specific guidelines that is laid down for inviting the FDI? For inviting the FDI?
Yes, there are rules in place.
I just want to know that in concern of the LIC, just we all are aware the way LIC is going through the public. Public will apply for that. Even there are the concern ki way government is also going to invite the FDI in that project. How they can going to increase the operational efficiency of the organization, which we all know is performing very well at the moment.
See, one is it, please.
And how it is decided if we will invite the FDI in that particular sector, then it will be able to increase the operational efficiency or will add to the profit of that concern.
No, so it's not about guaranteeing operation. One is that they have increased FDI cap in the insurance sector. That's for one. So the idea is whether we go for privatization or we go for inviting FDI into the country, there is no guarantee of operational efficiency, but that is what we have seen over a period of time. So the first exercise of disinvestment and privatization which took place was witnessed that for a lot of PSUs which were privatized, they functioned much well because the motive for a private player is to earn more profits. And to earn more profits, they would find ways to do things more efficiently, to care for cost competitiveness, and to improve operational efficiency. That's the underlying assumption. So, whenever we compare for private or public, ko jab bhi compare karte hain, to motives different hain. Even capitalism, socialism, jab hum compare karte hain, that is the purpose. So private players, they strive for profit. And in that striving, they would obviously struggle to get the maximum efficiency. That is not the case with public sector. That is not the primary motive. So the reason, why we have socialism or why they are state-owned is so that the government can direct the resources toward its, well-defined channels where it thinks the social welfare is the most. So welfare is the motive there. And that is the reason. So that is a normal expectation that when, a foreign player comes in, or even when it is privatized, they will strive for more operational efficiency. We saw that also.
As a layman, it is said that government is a welfare state. Okay.
Government is a
welfare state. And whereas the LIC is concerned, it is not run by the government, it is run by the amount that public has deposited into the LIC. If we go for the profit earning or for the FDIs, it also going to be resultant in the loss of employments. The India, which is already reeling under the pressure of unemployment, in that circumstances, do you think these types of decisions shall be valuable for the economy?
नहीं, ऐसा जरूरी नहीं है. It will lead to unemployment. This is not necessary. We don't know how the new.
If we go by the examples, की जैसे मान लीजिए भी तमिलनाडु में एक जिंक का example है, कौन सी हमारी जो Mr. Anil Agarwal, something is that he has taken over the zinc company from the government of India. Large number of people has been given a voluntary retirement. They are working with the less capacity with the increased technology. So whenever the private players or the multinational or FDI will be invited, they will go for the technology instead of the human beings.
So, वो एक तो वो company to company vary करता है. दूसरा क्या है, for larger sectors like insurance, it is quite possible that the government might issue guidelines also before inviting FDI. तो FDI भी अलग-अलग sectors के अलग-अलग guidelines होते हैं. और so if the government is, insurance sector, for example, would be coming under that category where they may not allow 100% automatic route. तो हमारे FDI में एक ऑटोमेटिक रूट होता है, गवर्नमेंट अप्रूवल रूट होता है. तो बहुत से सेक्टर्स जहां पे हमें ये लगे तो वहां से हम गवर्नमेंट अप्रूवल रूट के थ्रू उसको रूट कर सकते हैं. और क्वाइट लाइकली कि इंश्योरेंस में भी ऐसा ही होगा. सो एज टू मेक श्योर कि उसका कोई डेट्रीमेंटल इफेक्ट ना हो एम्प्लॉयमेंट पे. और कुछ सेक्टर्स ऐसे होते हैं जहां पे हम ऑटोमेटिक रूट पे फॉरेन प्लेयर को आने देते हैं. अभी हमारा रिसेंटली एक साल पहले हमने FDI पॉलिसी को मॉडिफाई किया था, जहां पे हमने ये कहा था कि जो भी FDI नेबरिंग कंट्रीज से आएगा वो गवर्नमेंट अप्रूवल रूट के थ्रू आएगा, इवन अगर वो सेक्टर ऑटोमेटिक रूट पे है. तो उसका पर्पस भी ये था कि प्राइमरीली नेबरिंग कंट्रीज में चाइना इज व्हाट वाज रेलेवेंट. बाकी जगह से तो हमारे पास इतना FDI नहीं आता, चाइना से आता है. और चाइना के केस में हमने क्या नोट करा कि बहुत से इंडिया के ऐसे स्टार्टअप्स हैं जिसमें चाइनीज स्टेक बहुत ज्यादा है. तो हम वी टेक प्राइड की यूनिकॉर्न्स हैं, इंडिया हैज अ लॉट ऑफ यूनिकॉर्न्स इन प्लेस एंड देयरफॉर वी आर डूइंग सो वेल इन स्टार्टअप्स. तो प्रॉब्लम ये आइडेंटिफाई हुई कि स्टार्टअप्स बनते हैं, सक्सेसफुल होते हैं, उसके बाद उन्हें इन्वेस्टमेंट चाहिए होता है. तो इन्वेस्टमेंट या तो डोमेस्टिकली उनको मिले इंडिया से, या फिर उनको दे हैव टू सीक फॉरेन इन्वेस्टमेंट. तो बहुत सी चाइनीज कंपनीज, पर्टिकुलरली अलीबाबा ग्रुप, टेंसेंट एटसेट्रा, दे वेंट फॉर जिसको हम बोलते हैं प्रेडेटरी एक्विजिशन. तो लो प्राइस पे बहुत उसका स्टेक एक्वायर कर लिया और ओवर अ पीरियड ऑफ टाइम वो फिर दिस इज हाउ दे सॉर्ट ऑफ acquire things in the country. तो जब पैंडेमिक भी हुआ, बहुत सी ऐसी कंपनीज थी जो who couldn't survive in view of the fact that the economic activity was depressing. उस टाइम पे उन्हें acquire करना बहुत easy था और stakes भी बहुत low थे. They were willing to sell their assets at a low price. तो ऐसे जब चीजें नोट हुई तो फिर हमने अपनी FDI पॉलिसी को मॉडिफाई किया, where we said कि not naming China, we said कि जो भी FDI neighboring countries से आएगा, that will be routed through the government's committee constituted for this purpose. तो वहां पे हम पर्पस को आइडेंटिफाई कर सकते हैं और अगर हमें लगे कि पर्पस प्रेडेटरी एक्विजिशन का है तो हम वहीं पे उस कंपनी को स्टॉप कर सकते हैं. तो ऐसे बहुत सी चाइनीज कंपनी को रोक दिया गया था टू इन्वेस्ट इन दीज सेक्टर्स. तो वो कर सकते हैं, वो पॉलिसी में हम उसको अलाइन कर सकते हैं उस मोटिव को. सो दैट इज पॉसिबल.
Thank you.
So that same can be done. Yeah.
All right. So I think if we do not have any more questions, so the one last time I'm asking if anyone has any question. Otherwise, we'll wrap this. All right then. Well, thank you so much. I think बहुत सारे लोगों ने जो है क्लास 12 तक ही जो है या फिर हो सकता है क्लास 10 तक भी इकोनॉमिक्स पढ़ी हो, and they went for some other subject and did not do. I'm not sure that what people had studied in when they went to for their higher education studies, but some of the things that you mentioned, I'm sure that it's something that you can already see in the comment box, people. Sumita Arora ji saying thank you, and participants here also are, and I also personally want to thank you for this informative and rather updated session on the Indian economy. As you rightly began it by saying that there are so many aspects of the economy that one can talk about, and therefore it is always challenging to have a generic, so to say, title, and also talking to a set of audience which again is not sort of directly dealing with economic issues. Nonetheless, is of course all of us are recipients of, you know, the manifests of the policy and what is happening at the macro level as well as of course at the micro level. So ma'am, can I thank you for this talk and interactive session, more importantly, and therefore this wasn't this was right after the lunch. So, but still, you know, we did not, I didn't see anyone here sleeping. So that itself is an achievement also.
That is, yeah. I remember doing my own refresher courses as well.
Yeah. You know, I've been telling them that, you know, it's when we do our faculty development program. So, you know, some of the times it's like some lectures are so boring. And we just wish that when the speaker would just shut up and go.
And the post-lunch sessions are pretty challenging that way.
They are challenging, yes. And of course, in the classroom also, we know if we are, unfortunately, if we get that slot, then we completely dread going into the class. So thank you so much, ma'am, for coming today and giving your time and the thoughts. So yeah, that's all I think for from all of us here, and thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here. Thanks to everyone.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And now to the participants, of course, we are going to now break. 4:30.
Between 4:15 and 4:30.
Yeah, and we'll join back somewhere between 4:15 and 4:30. You all have been very, very patiently waiting. या फिर ऐसा कहूँ कि ऐसा लगता तो है, अब आप यहाँ पे तो आ जाता है लिस्ट में कि वेटिंग टू बी एडमिटेड. अब एडमिट होने के बाद आप क्या कर रहे हैं ये तो पता नहीं है, लेकिन एटलीस्ट एडमिट होने के लिए यहाँ वेट कर रहे हैं ये हमें पता चल जाता है. तो थैंक यू फॉर योर पेशेंस that we are generally sort of sometimes we say 4:15 and we're not able to join.
They're skipping the topics and it is in our domain.
हाँ बिल्कुल, yes, absolutely. तो आपकी जो क्या बनती है, आप लोगों की ACR बनती है कुछ, उसके लिए नोट्स यहाँ पे तैयार हो रहे हैं. आप आपके कॉलेज में सब जगह कि कौन जो लोग हैं अपना माइक्रोफोन खुला छोड़ देते हैं और फिर जो है गप्पाबाजी वहां पे हो रही होती है और हमें भी यहाँ पे पता चलता रहता है. तो that's not done. Of course, I've mentioned that. Please don't do it. So that's all. But we'll meet again now somewhere between 4:15 to 4:30. So see you then.